Among fans of first-person shooters, there was once a sharp division between two separate groups with increasingly less overlap over time. This division was between the old school and the new school crowds. Whether it was PC shooters versus console shooters, or boomer shooters versus cover-based shooters, or any other dichotomy, it was apparent for a while that there was a dichotomy, where old and new FPS games were just different types of games that attracted different crowds. And that dichotomy has an almost exact turning point. Halo Combat Evolved. Certainly Halo wasn't the first successful console-based FPS, but it had a lot of the hallmarks of what would mark the supposed new school of shooters at the time. The shift away from fast movement and dodging projectiles in favor of waiting out long gunfights by taking cover, the shift away from high-powered weapons against large mobs of enemies and towards weaker and more vulnerable protagonists, and most important to this video, the shift away from large arsenals of weapons and having any weapon ready for any number of scenarios, to having a simple 2 weapons at a time structure, where weapons get swapped out throughout the course of a level or game. Ian Danskin from Innuendo Studios made a great video looking at the shift called What Makes an FPS Arsenal Good, a video I absolutely love, and this video is in no way really a critique of his exploration of the topic. In his video he calls the old school method of having all weapons at the same time an arsenal, and calls the 2-weapon system that was made mainstream by Halo the loadout. For this video, I'm simply going to call them an all-weapons system and a 2-weapons system, and while I agree largely with what he says in his video about what makes an arsenal good, I have some lingering thoughts about this topic that I want to address. See, I'm currently playing through Half-Life 2 for the first time in a long time. Half-Life 2 is one of my favorite games on release and had remained a favorite for quite some time. I guess I would say it still is one of my favorite games when it comes to narrative and presentation. It's a very thrilling game and a very engaging experience. But a lot of this is due to design trickery. And when I say design trickery, that's not a critique. Many great games are designed in such a way where they use illusions and trickery to convey a certain emotional experience. Picture it like a house that only consists of an exterior. It looks beautiful from outside, but the second you walk in or a wall comes down, it becomes apparent what the trick is, and that changes the nature of what you might appreciate about the house when viewed from outside. This is ultimately one of Half-Life 2's most glaring flaws, and it's a flaw that I think speaks to the heart of the changing design trends that mark the shift away from the old school to the new school, especially when it comes to the shift away from all-weapon systems to 2-weapon systems. This problem goes all the way back to, at the very least, the original Doom. Doom is a great game, but something innately true about its old-school design is that gunplay is only 50% a consequence of guns themselves. The other 50% is the environment and how the environment contextualizes gunplay. So, for example, let's look at the rocket launcher. The rocket launcher does a large amount of damage, enough to kill a Kaku demon in 3 shots. The rocket launcher is one of the most powerful weapons in the game, and considering its additional splash damage capabilities, low ammo consumption, and ability to fire at a somewhat fast speed, the rocket launcher becomes an obvious go-to as just a great weapon to have handy. So then why do I almost never use it? Well, because, again, the gun is only 50% of its value. The other value is the context of the environment. The rocket launcher doesn't only deal damage to enemies, it can often hurt the player too. This means that the rocket launcher is best suited to environments where splash damage against the player is unlikely, which almost always means large open areas where players can create a lot of distance from monsters. In the original Doom, tight corridors are much more commonplace than open expanses. This means that, if you're playing ideally, the rocket launcher is actually a far worse option than most of the other weapons in the game. Certainly if you create enough distance in a corridor, it can still be used effectively, but it can rarely ever be used more effectively than other, better suited weapons in a given situation. There are, as I see it, 2 types of weapons in shooters: universal weapons and niche use weapons. For universal weapons, they're effective as a weapon most or all the time while in the player's possession. For niche use weapons, their effectiveness is highly contextual, and they only end up coming into play in certain circumstances. One would think that the ideal arsenal is one that maximizes universally applicable weapons, to have all of the weapons be useful at any given time. But I would argue that the ideal arsenal is more about the balance struck between universally useful weapons and niche use weapons. Because even though sometimes a weapon will rarely come into use, niche use weapons allow players interesting new approaches to play and unique forms of player expression. The rocket launcher, despite being one of the coolest concepts for a gun, is not super applicable in the original Doom because the designers would have to design the levels to accommodate the rocket launcher really well, which they just didn't really do in Doom 1. It is a niche use weapon that id would have to design around its limitations in order to make universally useful, which in Doom is just not something that happens all that often. However, in Doom 2, we begin to see a lot more open expanses and a lot of great opportunities to use the rocket launcher. So then why, if it's better suited to Doom 2, do I use it even less than I did in the original Doom? Well, it's because Doom 2 introduces the super shotgun, which does about as much damage as the rocket launcher, has spread fire which can hit targets in a manner which allows for similar crowd control, it uses shotgun ammo which is by far the most common ammo you'll come across, and one of the only ammo types that certain enemies will drop when they die, etc. The super shotgun is so good, in fact, that when I play Doom 2, it's by far the weapon I use the most, because there is simply no context in Doom 2 where the super shotgun is not the best suited gun to the circumstance. In short, the super shotgun is a universally used weapon that replaces the niche use of the rocket launcher, making the rocket launcher almost entirely useless except for when players just want to blow something up. Don't get me wrong, Doom 2 is one of my favorite games of all time and I love the super shotgun, but if you were to actually look at how I play Doom 2, you're likely to see something interesting happen. I will, throughout the course of the game, default to specific guns in a pattern where I only use 1 to 2 important weapons at a time. Typically the super shotgun and the chain gun, or the super shotgun and plasma rifle. The fact that environmental context plays such a factor in the utility of a weapon in an FPS game is perhaps the main reason why the all-weapon systems of old-school shooters were replaced by the two-weapon system. Because the way the game is designed orients players into a funnel where they're more likely to use less weapons at a time, and more likely to use certain weapons dependent on the context of the circumstance that any particular level puts them in. If you make the level design primarily open expanses, players are going to use the rocket launcher for a large portion of the game. If you make the level design primarily tight corridors, they're going to use the rocket launcher for a much smaller portion of the game. So when it comes to interesting level design, players are always caught in a tug and pull between what weapons they're expected to have available and what weapons will end up being useful. There's one additional detail about level design in all weapons systems of note. Designers need to guide players to a certain experience, so when they want players to think a certain way, they have to push players in that direction with subtle cues. The most blatant example of this is in the final boss of the second episode of Doom, the Cyber Demon. The player encounters the Cyber Demon in a large open arena with very few walls. In the middle is a safe zone in which the player spawns, and in order to reach the arena proper, you'll be guaranteed to walk through one of 4 rooms. All 4 of these rooms contain boxes of rockets, and one of them contains a rocket launcher. The game is being very clear about its intentions in this moment. Use the rocket launcher. Because the player is being guided to use it, it becomes advantageous to do so. If you use any other weapon, you're more likely to run out of ammo. So because you have so much opportunity to replenish your rockets, the rocket launcher is clearly ideal in this circumstance. The devs wouldn't need to put rockets in the level for that to be the case. The open expanse lends itself well to using the rocket launcher regardless, but speedrunners intentionally bring a decent supply of plasma rifle ammo into the fight, which breaks with the sequence of what the devs clearly are expecting of the player in this level. Part of why the devs want players to use the rocket launcher is because the Cyber Demon has a rocket launcher himself, leading to a rocket duel. It's intended for the plasma rifle to be something the players can bring to the fight, but the devs make the plasma rifle somewhat obscure to get a hold of, and they don't give nearly as much ammo for it throughout the episode. So if you play through episode 2, you will expect to not have much plasma cells to use going into this fight unless you conserve them, which is what speedrunners end up doing. So even in the situation where the rocket launcher is most ideal, another weapon is more ideal. And so to make the rocket launcher more useful, the designers have to manipulate the player to need to use the rocket launcher by making the fight harder to win by any other means. This is not a problem with Doom or with old school shooters, but it presents a dilemma. Do you prioritize the player's arsenal so that the player feels at all times like they have total freedom and power, or do you prioritize the experience of the ebb and flow of gameplay, the experience of environmental storytelling, the experience of drama and tension, of overcoming odds, etc.? The consequence of this dilemma was part of what led to the shift to the newer school of shooters. The more immersive and exciting qualities of FPS that made the genre stand out during its early days ended up being better served by two-weapon systems by a certain point in the genre's history, because then designers had a lot more freedom in how they constructed the experience the player was expected to have. If we look at Half-Life 1, which for my money is the best set of weapons ever put into an FPS apart from maybe the Opposing Force expansion pack, Half-Life 1 has nothing but incredible weapon options. However, when it comes to essential weapon options, it boils down to a few simple ones. The crowbar, the pistol, the submachine gun, the shotgun, the crossbow, and the grenade. All of the other weapons, while fun to use and applicable in all sorts of interesting situations, effectively serve similar or identical functions to the weapons I just listed. Half-Life 1 is interesting because of how much niche use weapons are prioritized. There are at least 5 in the game, each with unique functions from one another. The trip mine, the satchel charge, the rocket launcher, the Gauss gun, and the snark. The Gauss gun is interesting because it has both a universal use element and a niche use element. Its universal use is its ability to be fired at enemies, which is almost always good for. But the more niche use element is the fact that the Gauss gun can also be used to propel the player, allowing for further jumping range when useful. The trip mines are worth looking at in some detail. Easily they're one of the most fun weapons to use in Half-Life. But, in the single-player campaign at least, they're also one of the items I use the absolute least. It takes a long time to set up. When it is set up, it can do damage to only a small number of enemies at a time, can easily end up backfiring on the player or even killing them, and beyond that, it's just not very effective compared to other explosive options like the grenade or the rocket launcher. So given the significant trade-offs required to make the trip mine worth using, the level designers have two options. Either force a niche use case by creating a section of the game where the player has to use the trip mine in order to progress, or disregard the trip mine in regards to level design altogether and have players discover niche use cases on their own. The trip mine is rarely or possibly never the ideal weapon or even the ideal explosive, but its presence allows the player more creative modes of play, even if those creative modes of play don't actually benefit the player's progression through the game and primarily serves to make the game more fun. This is what makes the death of the old school shooter in the 2000s and early 2010s such a disappointment to me. Because niche use cases are fun, and strange or unique mechanics are fun. It's fun to have options that are not necessary or even beneficial, but allow players unique forms of creativity and expression. The trip mine doesn't improve the game's balance of play, but it does improve the game's expressive opportunities, which to me is way more important. Now, looking at Half-Life 2, we begin to see something strange happen. Half-Life 2 has less weapons than Half-Life 1. Typically, we'd expect to see the opposite. As sequels come out, they expand the content that prior games in the franchise are known for, offering more, better, and more often. Instead, Half-Life 2 condenses a lot of the weapons down. Gone are a lot of the stranger, more unique weapons like the snark or the trip mine. Instead, we have a few obvious standards, most of them carryovers. The crowbar, the pistol, the magnum, the SMG, the shotgun, the rocket launcher, grenades, the crossbow. And aside from those, there's only one major additional gun added, the pulse rifle, with a secondary fire that shoots a strange energy orb that bounces around dramatically, instantly killing any enemy it comes into contact with. The pulse rifle is, effectively, just a better SMG, so really the game seems sorely lacking in the fun guns department. Of course, people who have played Half-Life 2 are noticing a glaring omission in my list, the gravity gun. Well yeah, let's talk about the gravity gun. The gravity gun is awesome. It's probably the best gun ever put into a first-person shooter and ties with the portal gun for maybe being the coolest gun concept ever. The gravity gun is definitely a weapon, but it's not a gun in the traditional sense. It's a physics weapon. It grabs objects from your surroundings and uses that as a weapon. And that's a lot of fun. The gravity gun is brilliant because it combines the niche use case elements of what we come to expect from the weird arsenal of a Half-Life game with universal use case elements as well. So long as there are objects to be grabbed and thrown, the gravity gun is useful for violence. And when not used for violence, it can be used for solving puzzles, for building staircases, for catching projectiles and throwing them back, etc. An example of a niche use case for the gravity gun is if the player wanted to set up cover for hiding behind but there was none nearby. The player could literally just pick up cover and move it into position, not only creating cover but allowing for the potential for moving cover. This is never necessary and won't come up all that often, but is an example of how valuable niche use cases can be. The gravity gun is brilliant because it amplifies the options for player expression while having universal applicability and thus being a gun that players will be switching to often. And the designers knew this because they created a dedicated button for switching to the gravity gun. The gravity gun is to Half-Life 2 what the super shotgun is to Doom 2. It destroys the need for most other weapons in the game, because it has universal use and functions to do a lot of the same uses that other weapons might have had. Now, let's look at the inverse scenario in Half-Life 2, the bug bait. The bug bait is one of the coolest additions to the game, but is also one of the biggest wasted opportunities, because the bug bait is entirely a niche use weapon. The bug bait allows you to attract antlions that you can then command to attack enemies. It's super cool, and it's an obvious evolution of the concept of the snarks from the first game. but while it's very fun to use, it only gets used in the Nova Prospect section of the game. So all things considered, it is an exclusively niche use weapon that only comes into play in a small chunk of the game. From that point on, it becomes completely useless. The bug bait is less a part of Half-Life 2's arsenal and more a set piece that the player gets to hold. It's really not even that important in the areas where it does get used. The antlions often will just start attacking Combine regardless of whether or not you're actively using the bug bait. It's more a visual token of the idea that you control the antlions than it is an actual weapon you use. The bug bait is Exhibit A in why the all-weapon systems of old-school shooters died off, because it's literally useless past a certain point, so carrying it around is pointless. If Half-Life 2 had used a two-weapon system instead, then the bug bait would have been much more valuable to the game and much more useful in general. It would become one of the two weapons you would carry through the section, and that would force the player to make more measured decisions about what other weapon to use to supplement the antlions, while also making the antlions a more essential strategic decision players would have to make. Making it a pickup, rather than a weapon you just hold infinite amounts of, would also result in a scenario where players would have the option to not use the bug bait and thus not have the antlions on their side, which would make the section much more difficult, but would also guide players naturally to want to use the bug bait to make the section easier. And then once those chapters of Half-Life 2 were completed, the designers would simply stop allowing bug bait to get picked up in the surrounding area, and you would end up swapping it out for a weapon that would be useful for later parts of the game. The bug bait as is in Half-Life 2 is an example of convenience in design, whereas if Half-Life 2 had been a two-weapon system game, we might have seen the bug bait be an example of cleverness in design. Half-Life 2 condenses the arsenal of Half-Life 1 to more bare essentials, but there's another quality that I noticed when playing through Half-Life 2. During the Nova Prospect rush, I kept switching to the crossbow. I was hoping to use the crossbow to pick off guards from far away, but I kept noticing I was very low on ammo. The crossbow gets introduced in the previous chapter, Highway 17, and during that chapter you get a lot of crossbow ammo to emphasize the new weapon and acquaint players with its utility. And then, for seemingly no reason, it suddenly becomes a lot harder to find crossbow ammo during the rush on Nova Prospect. Now, narratively, it makes some sense. The crossbow is a resistance weapon. The Combine wouldn't have ammo for it lying around. But from a game design perspective, another thought occurs. The reason why there's no crossbow ammo in this section of the game is because the devs want you to use the bug bait to kill faraway guards. This is Exhibit B in why the all-weapon system ended up dying off, because designers would have to program encounters, set pieces, and level design around specific weapons, meaning that having a large number of weapons at once was becoming increasingly useless and even detrimental to the player at times. In the case of the rush on Nova Prospect, I wanted to play the game in a sniper way, where I pick off guards one by one and sneak around more subtly, almost like it was MGS5. But that's not what the set piece called for. The devs wanted it to be a rush, with the antlions taking care of faraway guards and you primarily sending the antlions in to do so. There is a simple solution narratively so that players could play the game my way. Give them some equivalent Combine sniper rifle that would likely have ammo in this area. We even see that the Combine have sniper rifles early in the game, making this really easy to implement hypothetically. But for the narrative to work, the game has to make concessions to experimental gameplay approaches or player expressiveness in favor of funneling the player to think and act a specific way. It's common, as far back as Doom, for games to deprive players of certain ammunition and give them other certain ammunition in various areas so that the player will be likely to use a specific set of weapons depending on what part of the game they're in or what kinds of combat encounters they're going to expect. During the rush on Nova Prospect, the weapons we end up getting the most ammo for are the three essentials: SMG, pulse rifle, and shotgun, plus the two niche use cases. Bug bait is infinite, but the presence of antlions could be seen as self-replenishing ammo, and then the rocket launcher comes heavily into play during the battle with two gunships. So suddenly, where there wasn't a lot of rocket ammo before, there's a convenient self-replenishing box of rocket ammo that players can use to infinitely fight against the two gunships until they win. No need for resource management. The resources that you need are just instantly there the moment you need them. This is how the game feigns tension. Rather than the player having to make measured decisions with clear consequences for failed decision making, the player is given everything they need on a platter, but it's disguised with bombast so that the players feel as though the stakes are high. Now, the stakes would be high if the player chose to use a different weapon. If one were doing a Magnum-only run of Half-Life 2, this section of the game would be hell even prior to the 2 gunships. But because the bug bait basically gives you free attacks whether you want it or not, and you have infinite rocket ammo, this section is never really hard or intense beyond the emotions of what's going on in the story. While thumbing through 5 or 6 different weapons in a game like Half-Life 2 is common, what's more common is picking 2 specific weapons that you expect to carry you through large sections coming up, and then swap back and forth between them. I'm often setting myself up with a shotgun and an SMG and using the quick swap feature to switch between them, or I'm using a shotgun and a crossbow, etc. While the all-weapons system is useful, the overarching story of how players engage with the all-weapons system gradually and increasingly looks like a 2-weapon system anyway, at which point the all-weapon system started becoming redundant at best and detrimental to both player experience and designer intentions at worst. During the 2 gunship battle at Nova Prospect, you're unlikely to get use out of several weapons simultaneously, so quick swap will go a long way towards helping you in that moment, and one of the weapons will be pre-decided, the rocket launcher. Because the game guides you towards a specific mode of play, the game also guides you towards a small number of weapons at a time. Typically, the approach in a given combat scenario in an FPS game is to have important niche-use weapons be combined with one universal-use weapon. So designers will try to figure out which universal weapon is best for the given area of the game and place a lot of ammo for that weapon, and then do the same for the niche-use weapon. This is true in the Highway 17 and Sandtrap sections of Half-Life 2, where the SMG is given unlimited ammo by the buggy, and the prevalence of rockets pushes the player towards using the rocket launcher during any gunship fight. If this were a 2-weapon system game, very little would have to change in the 50% of environmental context that we see in Half-Life 2. You could make Half-Life 2 function identically to Halo in terms of how weapons are handled, and huge sections of the game would remain largely unchanged in how they feel to play. After all, in Halo, we see a lot of the same things occur. During heavy flood sections, players suddenly find weapons like the shotgun have much more ammo lying around for them to pick up. Players can swap between various essential weapons by finding them on the ground during areas where several types of weapons can be valid, and during areas where niche use becomes more important, such as a rocket launcher, the player suddenly starts finding rocket launchers and rockets lying around to pick up. Which brings me to my main point. The main reason why the arsenal died off is because it just wasn't that different from the loadout. Only being able to carry 2 weapons at a time was less sanding off difficulty, and more just calling a spade, and acknowledging that in a linear first-person shooter, having large numbers of weapons all at once doesn't serve much a very valuable function, because players are going to just gravitate towards a small number of guns anyway. This is ultimately not a flaw with how developers design weapon options. It's a flaw with how they design levels. So here's where I'm heading. The best thing a first-person shooter can do is strike a healthy balance between universal weapons and niche-use weapons. Gimmicky, strange, or not always useful weapons should always be present in a way that allows players to take unique approaches, and weapons that are always useful should always be present in a way that allows players to fall back on familiarity. If you're going to incorporate weirder weapons like trip mines in a game, you should also design your levels in such a way that implementing them is better than a normal weapon some of the time, and complements the normal weapon set at any time. Design levels where players can experiment with how they use these weapons. Create options so that players who are dedicated to a unique weapon have options throughout the game to implement them, even if it's better used in some places than others. It should be possible to play through all of Half-Life 2 with the Magnum, but it shouldn't be easy. It should be possible to use a trip mine in any given scenario in Half-Life, but it shouldn't always be ideal. It's also important to create weapons with multiple functionalities beyond strictly combat, such that weapons can have both universal and niche-use functions simultaneously. The gravity gun and the Gauss gun are great examples of this. They allow the player interesting approaches to movement and environment, while also being generally effective at combat regardless of the circumstance. The prevalence of new boomer shooters offers opportunities for exploring niche-use weapons in exciting new ways that were often wasted in old-school shooters. But the problem I'm seeing with games of that ilk, such as Dusk, is that they fall into the exact same issue as before, which is that giving players so many weapons that are universally good and so few weapons that are only contextually good means that players end up gravitating towards a smaller and smaller selection of weapons anyway. I haven't played much of the newer indie shooters, but as far as high-octane recent affairs, I've played Dusk and Doom 2016. Dusk is a great game as far as its level design and combat, but its weapon set is to me fairly lacking. It feels generic in a way that the rest of the game doesn't. And as far as Doom 2016 is concerned, it might offend a lot of people for me to say, but I think that Doom 2016 strikes a horrible balance with how the all-weapon system is implemented. Certainly every weapon feels good to use, but they're basically all universal use weapons and they're almost all largely interchangeable. Doom 2016 gets one thing right, which is that the guns all feel like expressions of player interest. If you like explosives, you're more inclined to use the rocket launcher, and unlike in the original Doom games, that's a move more validated by the design of the game. But the consequence is that you end up using most of the weapons for largely the same reasons and largely in the same way. The game even forces the player to swap between them somewhat regularly, not based on context or interesting level design choices, but based on a general gameplay loop that causes ammo to deplete fairly fast for any given weapon. Personally, I love sniping, and by that I mean I love high damage, precise, but doesn't fire very fast and can best be used at a significant distance. One of my favorite guns in any shooter is the railgun in the Quake series. For a similar reason, I love the Magnum in the Half-Life games and the crossbow. I love sniping not just because it changes how you aim and fire your weapon, it changes how you move, how quickly, how close or far you choose to get, how long you take to actually take a shot. The Halo series was always better suited to this mode of play than pretty much any other shooter I've played, because Halo gave big open areas where players could pick off enemies from a distance at regular enough intervals that there was always an opportunity for sniping around the corner. And often my pick for weapons in the Halo franchise were either the pistol and the sniper rifle or the battle rifle and the sniper rifle. Precise, high damage, and medium to long range was always how I played best. My knowledge of shooters is at this point fairly old school. I haven't played a lot of the new retro-style shooters nor any of the big AAA titles, so I haven't seen what FPS games have done since 2012 all that much. What I'd love to hear about from viewers is, what games have brought back the value of niche-use weapons that change the way you think, move, and act as you play? What games in the past 10 years or so have created an arsenal of weapons that allows the players to think creatively, to think strategically, to adapt their style of play to ever-changing circumstances, and that give players opportunities to explore alternative playstyles to the traditions of FPS run and gun or duck and hide gameplay that has come to define two whole eras of shooters? What games justify having more than 2 or 3 guns, in a way that feels really new and exciting and not just the tradition of having 8 weapons that's good because that's 8 different ways to kill everything on screen? I'm thinking stuff like the gravity gun, weapons that make you more attuned to your environment, to what you're up against, rather than simply being a lawnmower for enemies. And what weapons added in new shooters in the past 10 years have been particularly unique or interesting? Weapons that don't play like standard shooter weapons that have existed as far back as Doom. Weapons that get weird. Let me know, and thanks for watching. This video was made as a companion piece to a longer form video essay I'm going to be making about Half-Life 2, where I go in depth on the themes and storytelling elements of that game. If you're interested in seeing that video, I'm going to have part 1 of it up for patrons by hopefully the end of this year, and then I'll hopefully have the rest of it up by February and have that be public for everybody to see. And so that video is really awesome. I'm really excited to have it out. But I wanted to make this video to tide people over. If you like this video, then please subscribe, because I'm probably going to make more videos like this in the future. And thanks to my patrons, and thanks to any viewers who see this. Have a good one.